So, what we're going to learn today is about the laws of marriage. Laws of marriage happen to be in this week's parasha. They are also an incredible insight into our relationship with Hashem, because we always see that the relationship between Hashem and the Jewish people is like that between a husband and a wife, and the time of the giving of the Torah is considered the time of the chuppah. So there's this very strong connection between marriage and our relationship to Hashem. For that reason, it's not just technical, what we're going to learn today. It's going to have a tremendously important application. We are going to start, though, with something which is technical. Okay, so the first part of what we're going to learn over here today might sound like it's a little bit halachically overwhelming. The information we're going to learn, though, is going to help us to get this incredible perspective about our relationship with Hashem. Okay, so let's start. Let's start with the halacha, with the laws of marriage. How is a marriage sanctified? How is a marriage processed legally in Judaism? So what do you need? It's actually fairly straightforward. Obviously, you need a husband and wife. You need a chosin and a kala. You need a groom and a bride. That's obvious. But the mechanism by which the chosin is able to marry the kala is something we've witnessed many, many, many times. And because of that, because we're so used to it, because we go to weddings, because we see weddings, we don't necessarily stop to ask ourselves, so what's actually happening? So what do we see? We see a man takes a ring and he places it on a woman's finger. And that is the act of the beginning of marriage. Why I say the beginning is because there's still the process of the Sheva Brachos. But really, it's that moment where everything changes. It's that moment where their status changes. It's after that moment, and of course this is if the ring is presented with the formula, Hareat Mekudeshes, where the man says that he betroths the woman, and it is performed in front of kosher witnesses. Obviously, without that, it would be ineffective. But when that happens, when all of those requirements are satisfied, at that moment, Kiddushin occurs. And Kiddushin means that from there on, if this couple chooses now to separate, they would have to go through formal divorce proceedings. And that means that from that moment on, this woman is forbidden to any other man. Now, we know that technically in the old days, there was the possibility of a man having more than one wife. That's not what we practice today, certainly not for the last 1,000 years. But principally in halacha, what shifts at the time that a chosin, that a groom puts a ring onto the color, the bride's finger, is her status changes. That is called Kiddushin. Now, as far as the Torah is concerned, there are alternatives. There are other ways that Kiddushin could happen. But the way that we use today is what the Gemara calls kesef, which means that the husband takes something of financial value, in this case the ring, for a variety of reasons, which we're not going to get into right now, and it gives the ring, and it has to have a minimum monetary value. That's why you'll find that the witnesses have to confirm that it's actually worth a pruta, which is the smallest amount, the smallest currency, and then the marriage goes forward. So Kiddushin, the act of sanctifying a woman and making her uniquely the wife of a particular man, that happens at the time of giving the ring. So now let's get into the technical halachic side of it, and this is where things get really interesting. It's a chicken and egg question. Let's step out of marriage for 1 second, and let's talk about any other transaction that happens. Any other transaction means the transfer of an item from one person to the next person. Now, that could be a sale, that's one kind of transaction. It could be a gift, different kind of transaction with different rules. It could be inheritance, different kind of transaction with different rules, or it could even be a process which is called hefker, which effectively means that the owner of a particular object says, okay, I don't care about this object anymore. Whoever wants it can have it. And then, of course, whoever comes along and takes it, it becomes theirs. All of those constitute transactions. And in every case, the word that we use for that transaction is called kinyan. That's the technical halachic term. The correct Hebrew term, it's called kinyan. Kinyan means to take ownership of, to cause a transaction to happen. So again, the details of whether there is a transfer of money, a sale, or if it is just a gift, or if it is an inheritance, or if it is hefker, that's all detail. But what is fundamentally true about all of these scenarios is that these are kinyan. Okay? Now, if we're going to follow the kesef, the monetary value form of marriage, then that implies that there is a kinyan. The ring used to belong to the man, and by him giving it to the woman, it now belongs to her. That's a kinyan. Kinyan is transfer of ownership. And in this particular case, it would probably be a kinyan that falls in the category of a gift, because he's not asking her for anything financial in return. She's not buying it from him. They're not bartering it for something. He's giving her, it's a one-way gift. He's giving her the ring, placing it on her finger. It is now hers. That is a kinyan. That is an acquisition. That is a transaction. And it is binding. So here's where it gets halachically intriguing. Is a woman married because a kinyan took place? Or does the fact that they choose to marry make the kinyan take place? Okay? Chicken and egg. And as I did say right at the beginning, this is a little bit technical, but it's going to help us to understand the fascinating nature of our relationship with Hashem, so it's worth our while to examine this technicality. Again, is it that there's a transaction that happens? The chosen places the ring on the Kala's finger. In doing that, he gives her the ring. It's now hers. That's a transaction. And therefore, because they've made that transaction, and of course he said the requisite formula, and they were witnesses, the transaction changes her status, and she is now mikudeshes, betrothed and married to this individual. Or is it because this guy intends to marry this woman, and this is the ritual that we use for marriage, that is what consolidates the kinyan, the transaction, which would mean it's not like a classical gift. Classical gift, I don't have to know the person's intention. Somebody walks over to you, could be an absolute stranger, and they come and they give you something in your hand and say, this is a gift for you because I'm in a good mood today. It's absolutely binding. Now, if we're going to say that it's because he chooses to marry her, therefore the ring now belongs to her, it would actually be a unique category of kinyan. Okay, so you follow? There are two possibilities. Either the kinyan transaction makes the marriage, or the marriage ritual makes the transaction. Now, in the examination of this possibility, there's a great rabbi called the Rogatchover Gaon who lived not so long ago, and he was the rabbi of Dvinsk, the Hasidic rabbi of Dvinsk. He was an amazing scholar with an incredibly sharp mind who very often proposed perceptions and interpretations of halacha that are very difficult to understand because he was so sharp. So he's the one who raises this question. Is the kinyan the cause of the marriage, or is the marriage the cause of the kinyan? And just to explore it further, he actually gives some examples. We'll look at two of those examples. Two examples. Here's example number one. Example number one is, let's say, and it's a very strange scenario, but the Gemara very often does discuss strange scenarios. So the Gemara discusses a scenario where a person is about to divorce his wife, and needless to say, at that point, they're not on good terms. Because they're not on good terms, he actually doesn't really want to have to engage with her, and she doesn't want to have to engage with him. So they're very standoffish. He's got the get, which he has to give to her. Only once she receives that document in her hand is she divorced. He doesn't want to give it to her. They're so bitter with each other, he doesn't want to give her the get. So what does he do? He says, I'll come outside your house, you come out to the street, and we'll do it there. So she steps onto the street, and the reason it's relevant that it's a street is because it's not her property. If it was on her property, this whole issue would have been resolved. But it's in public property. Now, in public property, you can't say that just because something's lying in the street, it's automatically yours. He takes the get and he throws it at her. So the halacha is, the ruling is, if the get lands closer to her than to him, she's already divorced at that point in time, even before she picks it up. If it lands closer to him than to her, then it's still like it's in his property and they're not divorced. The same thing, and this is why it's relevant to our conversation, the same thing would happen in a marriage context. Now, why the person would get married to a woman in this way doesn't seem to make any sense, but that doesn't stop us from examining the legal possibilities. Let's say, for whatever reason, I just saw yesterday that there was this couple who decided that they wanted to get married on the ski slopes of somewhere in Italy. So they got the entire wedding party. It wasn't a very big wedding. It wasn't a Jewish wedding. It wasn't a very big wedding. And everybody, every one of their guests and every one of the retinue, and everybody was dressed for a wedding on skis going down the slope. So I don't know exactly where they did the ceremony, if it was at the top of the slope, at the bottom of the slope. The point is, people do strange things. People get married tightrope walking across the Grand Canyon, or on top of hot air balloons, or scuba diving. So for whatever reason, this couple decided that the way they're going to get married is he's going to fling the marriage token at her, the ring, or it could technically be a document, because there's that's another way that technically you could get married. You could write a marriage document and throw it to her. It's not the ksuba, don't get confused, it's a different document. But, okay, so he throws it at her. So there's the same question. If it's closer to her, they're married. And if it's closer to him, they're not yet married. Okay? So that's like, it's a very interesting area of halacha, because it's the kind of concept that you wouldn't expect. So let's say, for argument's sake, instead of giving her a ring, he decides he's going to give her a pouch of money, and he's going to throw it at her. And it's going to land, he's standing 20 meters away from her, and it's going to land after the 10-meter mark, so it's closer to her. Now, why is this relevant that they're married? Because halachically, legally, if you're standing in a public space and somebody wants to give you something and they don't give it to you in your hand, so there's actually a rule that says there's an area around you, an area of what's called daled amos, 4 amos, which is approximately 2 meters. And if you're in a public space and an item that doesn't have another owner, it's hefker, or it was given to you, lands up in your radius of 2 meters, it is yours. But in this case, we don't hear the requirement that it's got to reach within 2 meters. We only hear the requirement that it has to be closer to the woman, which means it's possible that he takes this pouch of coins, which he's using to marry her, throws it at her, it lands outside of her 2 meters, where by right should be able to acquire things, and still she's married. That tells you that the kinyan hasn't happened yet, because the rules of transaction don't apply when the item's not within 2 meters. So that would tell you that the marriage causes the kinyan. Okay? That would be an argument to say that the ritual of marriage in this particular case changes the rules of how the transaction is supposed to happen. And now the money belongs to her, even though using the normal way of acquiring money, it wouldn't belong to her. That would be an argument in favor of saying that the marriage creates the kinyan. The truth of the matter, though, is that there could be an argument the other way. This is also another interesting concept. By and large, and for those people, for example, who study the Daily Rambam, it's actually what we're discussing right now in the Daily Rambam, the law of verbal commitments, what we call a neder. So let's say that a person makes a verbal commitment. The person says, I am going to consider all meat forbidden. Right? The person says that's their undertaking, which basically means that they swear that they're never going to eat meat again. And then as the words come out of their mouth, they say, oh, sorry, I didn't mean that. We say, fine. It's called toich kedei dibur. Within a short period of time being basically the amount of time it takes to greet your rabbi, what's called shalom alecha Rebbe umoiri. So it's a very short space of time. If a person makes a statement, and in an immediate space of time quickly reneges on the statement, we say that's fine, that's acceptable, you have cancelled your statement. And that applies not only to the laws of verbal commitments, it applies to a whole spectrum of different areas in halacha. There's an exception. Let's say that a person gives a woman an object. Now let's not say wedding ring, because wedding ring is a little bit too obvious. So let's say that he gives her a different piece of jewelry, a nice gold watch, a necklace, and he gives it to her in front of 2 witnesses, and he says the formula, Hareat Mukudeshes, that she is now betrothed to him. And then a second later he says, oh, no, I was kidding. We say, sorry. It doesn't work that way. This is not one of those statements that you can cancel. We assume that if a person's going to propose marriage to a woman, he's probably thought about it. We're going to assume his heart was in it. We're going to assume that it's a highly unlikely scenario that he'd have such a massive change of heart right then and there. So we ignore him. We ignore him completely. Now, here's an interesting detail, nuance within that law. If the person says to the woman, here is this watch, ring, pouch of money, new car, whatever it is that he gives her, and he says, and with it you will be betrothed to me. What I mean is, it'll be a gift. We say that's fine. That's an acceptable way that a person can change their mind, because ultimately it makes sense now where he was going with this. It's not like he's canceling his whole proposal. He was obviously planning to give her something. For whatever reason, his mind was a little bit distracted, or his mouth got ahead of him, and he said something he wasn't yet ready to say. But the fact is, he still wants her to have the item, so it's hers. What does that show you? That shows you that the marriage does not make the transaction, because look, he can change the transaction now. He can change it to something else. So the point is that there's a strong argument in both directions. Now, the purpose of our conversation over here today is not to get into this whole debate about whether or not marriage makes the kinyan, the transaction, happen, or the fact that the transaction is what makes the marriage happen. I'm just illustrating that because it has this fascinating halachic perspective about which causes which. But what we're going to focus on is what that means to us spiritually. Okay? So without getting too caught up in the technicalities, we have a simple question we're trying to ask. Does the acquisition make the kiddushin, the marriage, or does the kiddushin make the acquisition? That's really what we're going to focus on. And bearing in mind that everything about marriage is supposed to be representative of our relationship with Hashem, so the two possible modes must both be relevant in our relationship to Hashem. And in order to understand what these two modes could be, we're going to analyze three things about how marriage works. Again, specifically, how marriage works through kinyan kesef, which means that the man gives the woman something of financial value. So specifically in that context, there are three things to look at. Let's start off first by asking ourselves, what is the meaning of the term kesef? Kesef. Now we know what kesef is, right? Kesef is money. How did money get to have the name kesef? Actually, kesef is silver. And in those days, you can well imagine that coins were worth their weight in the metal that they were made out of, which is a little different to our world today, where you have paper money and you have credit cards and you have cryptocurrencies, where there might not actually be a real value. It's accepted value. People have decided that a crypto is worth X amount. It doesn't actually have some commodity that matches it. But in those days, everything was worth its weight. So if people had money in those days, they either had copper coins or silver coins, or in rare circumstances, they had gold coins. It turns out that silver coins were the most common way that people would transact, and so naturally that becomes the name for money, kesef, silver. Except that nothing is by accident, and nothing is by chance, and everything is part of Hashem's master plan. So the fact that kesef becomes the name for currency is extremely relevant, because the word kesef also has another meaning besides meaning silver. And it talks to the psychology of money. What's the psychology of money? More than anything else, people want it. That's probably the primary psychology around money. People want money. People who don't have money want money because they believe that if they have the money, they'll be able to live a better life. People who have money, it's a strange psychology. As their wealth grows, so their appetite for money grows as well. The Gemara describes it this way. The person who has 100 coins naturally wants 200 coins. And the moment they have 200 coins, the psychology is that they now want 400 coins. So this concept of wishing for and yearning for something that you don't already have, which is very much the psychology of money, is related to this word kesef, because lichsoif means to yearn for something. Like the pasuk says, nichsoif nichsafti. They have this yearning, have this tremendous yearning for Hashem. By the way, that's one of the reasons why kesef becomes a name for the mechanism by which marriage happens, because what we want to illustrate is that there's this yearning. These are not just two people who've conducted some kind of a business agreement. Okay, listen, we're going to live together. We're going to build a family, going to share assets, we're going to share resources, we're going to share nachas. That's not what it means. The concept of marriage is that there's a certain yearning that they each have for each other. So symbolically, this idea, which is the predominant way that we do marriage, not only predominant, it is now the way that we effect a marriage today, is through kesef. It is unacceptable to marry using any of the other methods without kesef. So it's kind of representative of what marriage is all about. And if that is supposed to be symbolic of our relationship with Hashem, well, then there's the first piece of information that we know, is that our relationship with Hashem is supposed to be built on a sense of yearning, a sense of kesef. We don't just do what Hashem wants because we're committed, or because we have no choice, or because we grew up that way, or because we're religious. We do what Hashem wants, or at least we should, with a sense of yearning. I would like to have a relationship. I would like to connect with Hashem. That's what should drive our observance. So that's point number one. Point number two is that in the course of marriage, effectively two things happen. And there are effectively two sides of a process, or dare we say two sides of a coin, right? Just to borrow the expression. There are two sides of a process. The one side of the process is, by giving the ring to this woman, he is meyached. He is singling her out from all other women on the planet and saying, this is the woman who will be my wife. Remember that the mechanics of marriage are that the husband, the man, is the one who has to do the action of marriage, and the woman is more passive in the sense of accepting the role or accepting the invitation by accepting the ring. So this concept of being meyached, of designating or dedicating a particular individual as one's wife, is very powerful. It's very powerful. It means that there's something unique about this person that no other human being on the planet has. And therefore, we're going to have a unique relationship that we will never share with any other person on the planet. And that's why, by the way, what do we do after a chuppah? What happens after chuppah? Everybody sings and mazel tov. What happens? They then go into a room that is called yichud. Now, the meaning of the word yichud actually has multiple meanings. Yichud means something which is alone, from the word yochid, alone. So that's the practicality of it, that the husband and the wife, the chosen and the kala, go into this room and they're alone and nobody else is allowed to be there. That's one part of it. But the other part of it is that yichud comes from the word leyached, to designate. By going into that room as chosen and kala and have nobody else disturb them. And in fact, we even put sentries, right? We put witnesses outside on the door to make sure that nobody else can go in. That is a public statement of leyached, that they have now designated each other as unique. And that's the other meaning of the word yichud, is unique. That something is meyuchad. It is unique. It's different to everything else. So the second point that we're learning about marriage is that marriage is a moment which is driven by nichsoif, nichsafti, by this tremendous yearning, and therefore results in what? In yichud, in a unique connection, a unique bond, a unique relationship that is to the exclusion of everybody else, which brings us to the third point, that word exclusion. Because the other side of the same coin, when you say yichud, you're emphasizing what is special about that person to me. They are meyuchad li. They are unique to me. They're designated to me. That speaks very much about the positivity in the relationship between the two of them. But then there's another element to it, and that is the element of what that means for everybody else. The moment a woman is designated as the wife of somebody, that automatically makes her forbidden to every other man on the planet. That is the other side of marriage. The blocking out everybody else, the exclusion of everybody else. And that is represented by the word kiddushin, because unfortunately people tend to misinterpret the meaning of the word kadosh, which is obviously at the root of the word kiddushin. Kadosh means holy, which is a translation, doesn't necessarily give us a definition. Most people mistakenly think that holy means that something is imbued with some kind of otherworldly spirit. People think that the meaning of the word kadosh is that something is sparkling with holy energy or whatever. Actually, the word kadosh means something which is separated. And that's why you'll find in the Torah that we don't only use the word kadosh or its permutations in the context only of holiness. We use it in various other contexts as well. In fact, some of them are actually quite negative. So, for example, when we speak about the prohibition against not only grafting two different species of plants, but even allowing two different species of plants to grow into each other. So the Torah talks about, and this is so Torah speaks about a vine and the prohibition against allowing other vegetables to grow within the space of the vine, or produce wheat to grow under the vine. And there it says, if the two should mix, the vine and, let's say, the wheat, then it's pen tukdosh. It doesn't mean that it will become holy. It means it will become something separated that we're not allowed to partake of. We're not allowed to enjoy it anymore. It is now distinct. It's separate from everything else. And likewise, we find that the word, or at least one of the words that is used in the Torah to represent a person who is designated for promiscuous behavior, is a kedesha. God forbid, doesn't indicate that that person is holy. It means that that person is excluded from normal moral behavior, because they've now chosen to take a path which is promiscuous. So the word kadosh always means distinct and separate or excluded from. Kiddushin is the act of excluding somebody from the rest of society. This individual is no longer available. They're no longer allowed to have a relationship with other people from the society. In fact, if they did, it would be at worst adultery, or at best what we call the soita, which could be quite damaging to the whole relationship. So now we're seeing that there are three elements that we effectively can identify in the marriage process. There's this concept of kesef, which represents the emotion behind it, this yearning, this desire, very strong desire to be able to connect with another person. There is the yichud, the designation of that person as somebody who is very special, and therefore we have a special relationship with them. And there is the concept of kedusha, which is the exclusion of everybody else in order to facilitate the yichud. So because everybody else is excluded, that highlights why this particular relationship is such a unique relationship. And that's what we're supposed to achieve in our relationship with Hashem. All three things. We're supposed to have this nichsoif, nichsavti. We're supposed to have this tremendous yearning that we really wish to have a connection to Hashem. We're supposed to have this element of being designated as unique in Hashem's eyes, which is effectively the concept of, so to speak, choosing Hashem as our God in the same way as Hashem has chosen us as his people. And then there's the practicality of it, which is we have to exclude certain behaviors from our lives, the concept of kedusha. As the pasuk says, kedoshim to you, that we have to be holy, which effectively means, if you have a look, Rashi immediately tells us that we have to avoid certain relationships, because kedusha means to exclude certain influences from our lives. Now the question is, what are those influences? Everybody would naturally say, oh, well, in order to have a relationship with Hashem and to have a meaningful relationship, obviously what I have to do is I have to exclude out of my life anything which is forbidden by the Torah. And that would be true, obviously. Because the greatest obstacle to a connection to Hashem would be to do something which is against what Hashem wants. You can't have a relationship with somebody at the same time that you're cheating on them, right? So a person can't have a relationship with Hashem, but in the background, we can say, okay, I don't really believe that Hashem cares about what I eat, or if I keep Shabbos, or etc. That wouldn't make any sense. When we talk over here about Kedusha, about this exclusion of the world from our activities, we're not simply talking about removing things that are forbidden by the Torah. We have a principle that is called Kadesh Atzmecha B'mutar Loch. That the way we are Kadesh, the way that we sanctify ourselves, is actually specifically tied to the activities that the Torah allows us. The way a Jewish person engages with activities that the Torah permits should be absolutely different and unique to how those same activities would be followed by anybody else on the planet. How do we make ourselves holy? By disengaging from the world. So if we had to speak about the principle of Kiddushin, the principle of Kiddushin means that we actually are supposed to, as Jewish people, in order to be designated to Hashem, part of the process and part of the journey is not to be so immersed in materialism. That's often easier said than done, because we live in a materialistic world. We live in a time in history where materialism is freely available. In fact, much of what we today would take for granted as basic necessities are the kinds of things that our great-grandparents would have never dreamt of as luxuries. So the concept of Kedusha, of stepping back from the world and not allowing ourselves to be completely absorbed by or with the physicality, the hedonism of this world, is not so simple. Therefore, we have to now ask ourselves this question: chicken and egg. I want to have a relationship with Hashem. I have this kesef. I have this desire to have a relationship with Hashem. It's really important to me. And I recognize that having a relationship with Hashem will create this yichud, this unique relationship that will place me in a whole different space. And of course, Hashem will play a whole different role in my life. And I know that in order to facilitate that, part of what is necessary is kedusha, to step out of the world. I have to ask myself this question: which will be the cause and which will be the effect? Does kiddushin, the ritual of marriage, create the kinyan, the change of ownership, the move from one reality to another? Or does the kinyan, the shift of relationship, the shift of status, this used to belong to so-and-so and now it belongs to so-and-so, will that make the kiddushin? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. In other words, there's no question about it that when we have a meaningful relationship with Hashem, we will shift fundamentally. And unfortunately, the reality is that very often we don't expect that that's going to happen until it actually happens. We think it's like far-fetched. Somebody's telling me, if you do that, you're going to change. You're going to be a whole different person. Yeah, I know myself. I've dealt with myself for so many years. I know that I'm not going to change. I'm never going to change. So it's quite fascinating that there's the possibility of a total shift where a person can completely reinvent themselves. Like a kinyan. This object used to belong to so-and-so, and now it belongs to so-and-so. It's quite along the lines of, in the laws of Shabbos, it's a little bit of an aside, but it helps to illustrate the point. In the laws of Shabbos, we know that there's a big distinction between a domain that is called Reshus HaYochid, a personal or private domain, which is effectively like people's homes, etc., and Reshus HaRabim, a domain that is open to the public, and we have no jurisdiction over it. So legally, halachically, on Shabbos, we're not allowed to take something out of the Reshus HaYochid, the private domain, into the Reshus HaRabim, into the public space, or vice versa. And within the public space, the Reshus HaRabim, we're not allowed to move things at all. We've got a limit of 4 amos, which is not very much, in case of emergency. Philosophically, spiritually, this concept of Reshus HaYochid and Reshus HaRabim represents the two possible realities that a Jewish person could live in. The world in its default state is Reshus HaRabim. Rabim means the many. In its default state, our world is a place of multiplicity. All kinds of views, all kinds of opinions, all kinds of religions, all kinds of priorities, all kinds of deities. And a Reshus HaRabim, a place that accommodates or is willing to consider all the spectrum of difference, is a place of conflict, it's a place of immorality, and it certainly is a place of lack of consciousness of Hashem. That's actually where we all start. We start in the default state of the world. We start our lives in a place where the world is a chaotic environment, and there's a tremendous amount of conflict. Very often the conflict is our own, the conflict between what I know I should be doing and what feels very attractive to do. The goal and objective of the whole of Judaism is to take the Reshus HaRabim, a domain that is in the hands of everybody, and transfer it, kinyan, to become Reshus HaYochid, that it should all be in Hashem's domain. And basically what that means is to direct ourselves to a singular focus, where there aren't multiple directions and multiple paths. There's a single path to serve Hashem. When I'm in the office, I'm working to serve Hashem. When I'm exercising, I'm working to serve Hashem. When I'm taking a leisure stroll, I'm working to serve Hashem. When I'm eating, I'm working to serve Hashem. When I socialize, I work to serve Hashem. It's not a whole conflict of Rabim, of various different things that are at loggerheads. There's a singular funnel of everything in life that is directed towards Hashem. That's the goal. So to transfer the world, to make a kinyan, transfer the world from one status to another status. So that's the question. Does the kinyan make the holiness, or does the holiness make the kinyan? Does me stepping back from the world facilitate my connection to Hashem? Or does my connection to Hashem automatically result in me feeling less interested in the world? That's the debate over here. Does kinyan cause kiddushin, or does kiddushin cause kinyan? And the truth is, like everything else in Torah, whenever we have a conflict in Torah, we have two opinions in Torah, we never say one is correct and the other is wrong. We say, Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim. Both of them are correct. One is applicable in this circumstance and one is applicable in that circumstance. So for example, very often you may have two views about how something is supposed to happen. One will be applied in practice and one will still remain valid in concept. So here we've got two views and both of them are valid and they represent two different ways of how we grow in our Judaism and how we connect to Hashem. The first approach is Kiddushin creates Kinyan. That's an approach which says, let's be pragmatic. We're not high flyers. We're not people who just plug into God and automatically have these deep experiences that are completely transformational. We're not those people. We're practical people. We understand our responsibilities. We understand our challenges. We understand the time that we have on our hands. We understand that any growth that we do in any other area of our lives is always incremental. You've got to start somewhere and then you've got to move forward. What do they say? Just take one step or just do it. So I'd like to have a meaningful relationship with Hashem. And that's what's driving me, because I do have kesef, I do have the drive, I do have the wish to be able to connect to Hashem. But what I want is to get to that point of yichud. I want to get to that point where Hashem is so real and tangible and alive in my life that it's like we're one. So I know that right now my problem is there are way too many things that are distracting me. I enjoy my snacks, I enjoy good food, I enjoy a particular program on TV, I enjoy going to the gym, I enjoy hanging out on the beach. Whatever the thing is, every person has their set of materialistic interests that do, whether we're willing to admit it or not, detract from our relationship with Hashem. Everybody's different, everybody has a different hang-up. But what's common to all of us is that there's some element of materialistic attraction that blurs our vision of Hashem. So we say to ourselves, we need to be pragmatic. Pragmatic means, let me start by learning ways to divest from the world. It's the process essentially that we call iskafia. It's a big teaching in Hasidus where iskafia means that anytime we feel an urge to engage with the materialism of this world, we squash that urge. We don't allow it to manifest. We're not tzaddikim. It's not like we're never going to have those temptations. We still have the temptations. But we create a management system that says, I'm not going to engage as much as I would like to. So we divest a little bit from the world. And it's a gradual process and it works incrementally and we do one step at a time. So instead of having a second helping of dessert, or if a person says that their particular vice is that they love watching movies, so you say, I'm going to downgrade to documentaries, or I'm only going to watch things of Jewish content, which would be ideal, and so on and so forth. So the Kiddushin will cause the Kinyan to happen. Slowly, over time, when I take enough steps in a healthy direction, Hashem will come into focus and we'll start to develop this meaningful relationship between us. And this is a 100% acceptable approach in our Judaism. It is the approach that we call avodah she'al pi tam vodas, a rational approach to God. A rational approach to God says, don't run before you can walk. Don't take on more than you can handle. Understand, be patient with yourself, work things through, and you'll eventually reach your goals, and that is valid. It's absolutely acceptable. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that there's a totally different approach to godliness that we could also take, and that's the reverse. The Kinyan causes the Kiddushin. The shift of ownership, which is like a quantum leap, will bring me to a point that I step back from the world. In other words, I'll have such a deep relationship with Hashem. It will be so compelling and so powerful that as a natural result of that relationship, needless to say, I don't care much for the world. So that would be the approach of a person whose nichsoif nichsafti, their drive and the yearning for Hashem would become so powerful and central in their lives that it becomes almost an obsession. Instead of focusing on what to get rid of in their life, they become excited about what they want to introduce into their life. So how much godliness can I get? What can I do that will make Hashem more alive to me? So I'm going to daven more. Yes, I know I'm not yet at that level. And maybe there are various other steps that I have to take first. But I'm going to dive in head first. This is called avodah shelamaylo mitam vadas. This is a super rational commitment to Hashem, also known as the avodah of Mesiras Nefesh. Where a person says, I'm not going to wait until it makes sense to me. I'm just going to go headlong into my commitment to Hashem. Lichatchila ariber, as we call it in the language of Hasidus. Just leap right over whatever hurdles, either external or internal, are preventing me from doing what Hashem wants. That creates such a powerful, compelling relationship with Hashem. We become so excited by godliness that we naturally no longer care so much about the things of this world. Because the nature of human beings is that it is impossible to accommodate conflicting emotions simultaneously. So if I'm excited about the world, I'm not going to be excited about Hashem. But the corollary is, if I'm completely excited and inspired by godliness, then naturally what's going to happen is I'm going to feel less pull towards the world. And that's actually something we have to believe we're capable of. Because most of us don't believe we're capable of that. Most of us think we have only one path to Hashem, and that's the step-by-step incremental approach, and eventually we'll get somewhere. We don't recognize that actually fundamentally inside of ourselves is an neshama that intersects with Hashem, and therefore inside of ourselves is the capacity to be able to really throw ourselves down the gauntlet and go all systems go for Hashem. It is possible for us to get there. And when we recognize that that is possible, that means we recognize the possibility of real transformation. That we don't have to just be ourselves as we are now with minor improvements in our spirituality, but we're actually capable of being somebody altogether different. It's very valuable at this time of the year as we work through Elul, and most people do feel that the only way to get through Elul and to prepare ourselves for Rosh Hashanah is the incremental approach, and we try a little bit here and do a little bit extra there, and that works, and it's valid. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that there's another possibility, that we could just allow the neshama to speak. We could just commit ourselves to something that we don't dream possible in our Yiddishkeit. And via that, release a whole power of our own neshama, and with it, the other side of the coin, this lack of investment or care for the materialism of this world, and find ourselves in a totally different place. And that is perhaps similar to the principle that we call that there's the possibility of a person doing such an empowered teshuvah that they gather everything that they need for the world to come, literally in a moment. So Hashem should bless and guide us, that we'll be in a position to recognize the strength and the potential that we have within ourselves, the power of our own neshama, and that we use it, in Mitzvah Hashem, to release this connection that is beyond time badas, beyond anything that is rational, and as a result of that, secure for ourselves a ksiva v'chasima tova and all Hashem's greatest brachas, please God, for the coming year.